the victims. Martyn was one of 22 victims who were killed, and the inquiry into the event found that the poor planning in advance and then the poor response actually contributed to the attack happening, the scale of the attack, and they felt that had things been done differently, it wouldn't have been so severe. So they looked at how they're going to prevent this in the future, and they looked at the specific attack, but they also looked at other terrorist attacks in recent years that had perhaps used different tactics, such as Borough Market, Fishmongers Hall, and so forth. And Martyn's Law was put into draft bill in 2023 with the previous government. But with the new government, they appreciated this as well, and so it was in the King's speech, and so it is proceeding as planned. But be aware that this is still not law yet, and so what we'll be talking about today is very much what we're expecting to happen, but no guarantee that it will happen in law. Next slide, please, Yaz. So who is the law aimed at? It's aimed at pretty much any organisation or individual who owns or operates premises where the public have access. So the obvious ones are places like the Manchester Arena, concerts, festivals, sports stadiums, but it's far broader than that. It could be holiday accommodation, visitor attractions, shops, restaurants, offices. It really is quite broad, anywhere where the public have access. So that's the type of organisations we're thinking about. In terms of the venues, it's buildings, collections of buildings where you have like a campus, such as a school or university, or events or locations where there is a fixed boundary. And so as an example here, if we think about an event that we all know about, something like the London Marathon, at the start of the London Marathon, there is a enclosed area fenced off for the start of the race, and there's an enclosed area at the end for the finishers. Those two areas would fall within scope of the Act, but the race route itself wouldn't, because that's a public area and not confined. But many other areas, festivals, shops, restaurants, it's quite clear where the boundary is, where the public are admitted. Next slide, please. So the likely requirements of the Act are that firstly, the organiser will have to evaluate and assess the potential for terrorist risk, what they're going to do to prevent it, and how they would respond to it. They'd be required to put terrorism training or education in place for their staff, and put security measures in place to reduce the likelihood or the impact of any terrorist attack. They may be required to have a specific security officer appointed and have plans to prevent and respond to any attacks or potential attacks. And they also need to consider cooperation with the various other authorities and services, such as the local authorities, the police, fire, and so forth. Next slide, please. There are different levels of responsibility that the Act is looking at, and they're saying that really tiny venues or activities won't need to comply with this. But as soon as you have 100 members of the public, then this will come into force. So if you have between 100 and 799 individuals, you'll have to put basic measures in place, such as plans, procedures, risk assessments, and training. But once you get beyond 800 members of the public visiting, it becomes far more serious. And that's when you have to appoint people in specific responsibilities and take far more onerous or realistic measures to reduce the risks, which I think is, they're looking at sort of reasonable levels of effort here. So what they don't want is over the top response for a little village fete. compared to if you were hosting, say, an Oasis concert. One has a higher level of risk than the other. And we'll hand over now to Martyn. Sorry, not to Martyn, to David. Okay, next slide, please.
Just unmuting there, guys. So Martyn's Law, the implementation, the why, the what, the how do we use in terms of what Duncan was just talking about in terms of the security measures. Next slide, please, Yasmin. When using metal detecting knife arches in clubs, pubs and events, the use of these arches and other measures can reduce knife carrying incidents by 35 to 50%. Still a bit scary in that obviously it leaves a huge scope for people in this day and age to actually bring such weapons into a venue and so on. So it's done as part of a much broader suite of security measures that you need to address when looking at these sorts of things. And in recent times, even within the county, we've seen horrific events at nightclubs and pubs like that of such incidents of knife carrying. And indeed, particularly in some of the black country areas at this point in time, knife arches are almost standard issue outside of a lot of pubs and clubs. So, and one of the other factors involved here as well is that where you put these knife carrying countermeasures into place, you tend to just move the problem on elsewhere, unfortunately. But that's a sad indictment, I guess, of where we are at this point in time. Next slide, Yasmin. So what can we do to counter this? Well, obviously random searches, they can not always be effective and have certain issues. Metal detecting knife arches tend to be very, very efficient. We've all walked up to things like the airport baggage knife arches and always wondered, if I take my watch off, will my earrings or my glasses send this off? I don't want to get searched and all the rest of it. And you've always got that moment where you almost close your eyes as you walk through the arch, hoping that it isn't going to beep and you get searched from there. So they tend to have a very, very, very strong effect in terms of deterring would-be weapon carriers. And indeed, some of the work we do with the Met Police, where they set up random search stations at places like train stations and other public facilities, they tend to monitor people going through, but what they're actually looking for is the people that tail off the back of the queues, who slope off closetly, because invariably they're the ones that you need to get hold of. It's quite an interesting dynamic. Personal search ones, where you've actually got detection through knife arches, you get the pat down with those. Very much a good way of verifying any metal, and very much non-invasive either in this day and age. And of course, the ultimate end of the scale, which is full-on baggage scanners with or without AI. And these particularly are used in a lot of larger venues like the O2 Arena and so on, where they're trying to move massive amounts of people into a venue in a very, very short space of time. So if we move on to the slides and look at these specifically, random searches, as I said, not always effective. They can be very, very time consuming. And one of the things that does come out of this is invariably you end up with lots of queues. So ideally, and this is where we come in as LTS, where we have things like festivals, gigs, major events like we've done this summer, and we're also moving into the beer festival season, where we're also getting a lot of call for this. And typically you've got numbers of over 1,000 upwards people coming into an event in a short space of time. Things like this just clearly won't work. So we move on to the next slide. Metal detection knife arch can be seen as very cost effective. There are They're very, very simple to set up and use. We've all seen them at airports and used them or been used going through them. Relatively easy to maintain. Obviously, you've got to specify them, horses for courses, but they turn out to be a great deterrent factor, whether using them indoors or outdoors, and can be simply hired in. We do a lot of hire at this point in time for specific events, or if you're using them more often, perhaps in a school, a college, whether it be for weapon detection or even around exam time for detecting smartwatches and phones coming into the exam hall, purchase isn't as much as you would actually think. Next slide. Obviously, if you get a detection through the knife arch, traditionally we've always had the pat-down searches, but as we've seen with certain events in recent times, that can also be problematic as well. So the use of portable ones to actually, in a non-invasive way, actually search for metal on a person's body is a great way of actually verifying whether you've got a proper alarm or not, and again can be a great deterrent factor. Next slide. And then, as I said, at the apex of all of this, something like a baggage scanner, again, something fairly new to us at this point in time, can be deployed for larger events. Again, can be a hire-in if you need to, because particularly with some of these larger gigs and festivals these days, people like to take bags in. Perhaps they're allowed to take in picnics and stuff like this. So there's a lot of stuff to be searched. Again, they can be very, very accurate. And if you use things like AI, you can quickly find things like knives, guns, nitrous oxide canisters, even improvised IEDs. Now, picking up on another point that Duncan made a few minutes ago, you then have to decide how you actually manage any positives from this point. And what do I mean by that? Well, if somebody's got a knife in their bag, are you actually going to tackle them there and then with a lot of people around you? Or have you got some other strategy involved? And for instance, at one large event that we actually get involved with, they have a team that marks an individual person, lets them into the venue with their bag, and then they will take them out at some point at a safe distance away from the masses, because obviously you have to be cognizant that if there is a weapon in there, or even, God forbid, an improvised explosive device, an altercation with that bag can be actually quite costly in itself. So you need to think about the procedures and the risks involved, particularly when you're actually using this and any of the other equipment as well, which takes us nicely onto the risk assessments. Next slide. I think that's here. Yeah, obviously the how, you've got to do risk assessments. Duncan's going to talk about this in a few moments. What types of searches are needed? You know, what are people coming in with? If it's a pub, really there isn't much need in terms of bags and stuff like that, but there can be at times. It needs to be also respectful of personal needs, and we've all seen the news and so on in recent times where people are acutely aware of that. There may be a police requirement in terms of this as well. Who knows where it's going to go when this does become law. The best thing to do, if you're not sure, is seek advice and implement with professional help. And when necessary, and whether it's a festival over a day or two, or actually a long-term investment in terms of a doorway of a pub or a club or something like that, define your budget and define the cost that this is actually going to impact on your business as well. So with that in mind, going back to the risk assessment, let's hand you back to Duncan with the next slide.
So we've talked about risk assessments quite a bit, and it's clear in the draft bill that risk assessments will be important. Risk assessments are probably something that you face day to day anyway. Well, hopefully not day to day, but it's something you're familiar with, just with things like fire, slips and trips, and so forth. So all they're asking here is that you expand your risk assessment for your premises or your event to consider terrorism, which you may not have considered before. And when they've been preparing this this draft bill, they've been very aware that they don't want to go over the top. They don't want people having to spend lots of time, effort, and money, which could end up, closing down your village fete or your fun run because it becomes too onerous in terms of cost and effort. So it's really a proportionate response that they're looking for. And risk assessments, why do we do them? Well, we do risk assessments when we cross the road. We look left and right, we listen, and we cross when it's safe. A risk assessment is just a paper version of that. You're thinking about what could possibly go wrong by identifying the hazards. You assess those risks, you control those risks, you record the findings, and then you review them regularly. And if you go to the HSE website, there's some really useful guides on how to conduct risk assessments with some templates and examples for different types of industries. And likewise, if you need more help here, contact Yaz afterwards, and I'll be more than happy to share loads of templates and documents that we've got, which will help you do your risk assessments. It's really just formalising your thought process, putting it in paper. Another reason to do that is actually by formalising it and putting it in paper, you're thinking about some things that you might not have thought about before. So you're taking a mental step through your event, thinking about what could happen, what could go wrong, what you do to prevent it or reduce that happening, and how you respond to it. And by doing it formally means that you actually think about some things that are really useful. So moving away from terrorism, if you're holding this village fete and you're thinking about, well, how are people going to park their cars? Where are they going to park it? They're going to park it on the grass. What about what are the certain risks? Oh, it could be extreme weather. Oh, it gets really wet. Where are people going to park their cars? How are they going to get them off? So it's just going through that thought process of what might happen and what you might do about it. And another really important thing is if something does go wrong and you're hauled up in front of a court, they'll say, well, have you done a risk assessment? Had you thought about these things? And if you say, well, yes, I did think about these and we had lots of plans and procedures in place, well, you're guilty until proven innocent. You need to pull something out of your filing cabinet that shows that you've had to assess these risks, you've thought about them, you'd minimise the things that could go wrong, you discussed and trained them with your colleagues and staff or volunteers, and that will help defend court cases. And coming from the boring world of insurance, it's all about paper. If you haven't got the paper, you're guilty. So make sure you do your risk assessments. So next slide, please, Yaz. This is a quick example of a simple risk assessment. So let's imagine we're having a fete at a primary school, something we can all imagine because we've probably all been to one at some point in our lives. And we're thinking about some of the things that could go wrong. So maybe from a terrorist perspective, and let's be quite dramatic here, knife attack, bomb attack, gas, sarin gas, we've seen that on undergrounds, hostage situations, or even terrorist hoaxes. Think about these various things and do a little risk assessment for the various things that could happen. So on this particular example, we're thinking of a vehicle ram raid where someone, a terrorist or someone with a grudge or mental health issues decides to use their vehicle as a weapon to drive it at people. And we've seen this happen in the UK and Europe in recent years. So that's the hazard, is a vehicle ram raid. Who might be harmed and how? Well, it would be visitors and staff and volunteers at the fete. What are we already doing to control these risks? Well, there's a perimeter fence around the school to keep vehicles out, except by going through the gate. So what further action do we need to take to control these risks? Well, at the gate, we need to make sure that the gate is closed and manned. But people will need to come through the gate with vehicles at times. So maybe we'd need to check that they're people who should be coming through. And maybe the person at the gate needs to have a walkie-talkie or phone or communications with whoever's in charge to verify who's allowed in or out. And then who needs to carry out this action? Well, it would be the gate marshal that's responsible. And when is this action needed by? Well, you can think, well, the gate needs to be manned from the morning of the event all the way through the event, but only allowing vehicles in during certain hours when they're setting up and clearing away. And outside those times, you're only allowing emergency vehicles in. So that's a simple risk assessment for that kind of scenario. So it's not rocket science. It doesn't take a lot of time and effort and money, but you've thought about it. And actually, this would be relevant for all sorts of things, because for a village fete, we're not necessarily thinking about terrorists. It might be just someone that's daft or lazy that wants to drive their vehicle in because they can't be bothered to park where they could, and they could injure some small child running around. Also, it's thinking about, well, we might need vehicles in. So what if someone has a medical incident? You do need someone on the gate to let the ambulances in. So it's thinking about this. So when something goes wrong, you've thought about it, you've prepared for it, you've planned it. And that's one of the issues that went wrong at the Ariana Grande concert, was they had done some planning, but they hadn't thought about what to do if something goes wrong. So your risk assessment should lead on to things like method statements or actions on, so you know and plan what to do if something does happen. So do you make announcements? Who do you need to call and contact? If something goes wrong, do you open all the exits to let people out, or do you close all the exits to keep people in? These are all the things that would be considered as part of the whole risk paperwork process. Thanks, Yasmin. Next slide. And I think that brings us to the end of what hopefully isn't a terrifying, but it's been a useful introduction to this new law. Any questions?
Right, has anyone got any questions for either Duncan or Dave? And we'll be able to ask them in the next 10 minutes or so. We still have got a little bit of time. But yeah, firstly, I just want to say thank you both for coming together and putting together a presentation for us and sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. So we really appreciate you coming on and doing this. And if we do have any questions, I would be happy to facilitate those and put you through to either Duncan or David in my follow-up email, so I can do that for you. But I think we haven't got any questions this time. Oh, we have actually. So we've got a question from Ben. Do you know who the governing body will be for ensuring these measures are in place?
I can't exactly remember, I'm sorry, but I think the local authorities will have a responsibility for this. So so certainly larger events will have to register that or larger venues will have to register. And I think the local authorities are putting people in place to assist organisations and activities in how to implement Martyn's law. I will find out who the actual authority is. I do know, but I can't remember.
Okay. Thank you. We've got a question from Sophia. If we are hiring a venue, is it the responsibility of them to ensure these anti-terrorism, or us as we are hiring the venue and getting people there, or both?
Are you okay for me to answer that one, Dave?
Yeah, you carry on there.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a good question. The short answer is you're both responsible. The venue itself will have an ongoing procedures in place because they will be having events from day to day, but they will be different events of different types. As the event organizer, you will have to have policies and procedures in place specific to your event. But as you will have seen from one of the earlier slides, part of the Act requires you to collaborate. So there will be a collaboration between the event organizer and the venue operator.
And just to add on top of that, basically because of the even if you took a village hall, for instance, that had a rather large capacity, you could go from anything from, I don't know, a village committee meeting with about 10 people in maximum to perhaps, I don't know, a full-on disco or something like that for a fundraising event, which could, get several hundred people into a venue of that sort of thing. So as a result, you've got different measures depending on your risk assessment, of course, and getting that many people in that fast. So it's very much horses for courses.
Perfect. Good question. Thanks, Soph. I've got just a comment from Sarah. So sorry you missed the first part, Sarah, but I will be sending the slides out after the presentation. We also have recorded this session and we'll be uploading it to our YouTube channel. If you've got any colleagues or anyone else that you feel needs to see this, then that will be available on our YouTube. But I think that is mostly it. Do either of the speakers have any last comments?
Yeah, if anyone does want sort of template of risk assessments or guides to putting risk assessments together, just contact Yaz and I will email you the templates.
Yeah.
And as from our viewpoint, if you have any security issues that you need just some advice on, then please feel free to reach out to us.